Welcome once again to the Brownstone, Wolfe's sanctuary of logic, orchids, and murder. Do tell us where in the world you're listening from, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts. If you enjoy these cases, consider liking and subscribing. Now then, shall we begin? Nero Wolfe and Fritz's last grocery list. Right now, over 85% of the people watching aren't subscribed. If you've been enjoying these Nero Wolfe stories, hitting that subscribe button is the best way to be sure you never miss the next mystery. Your support helps keep these stories alive and lets us keep bringing them to you. The morning had begun with the sort of calm that Wolfe demanded from the household, though calm in that brownstone on West 35th Street was often another word for ritual. The windows stood cracked just enough to let in air that was neither too warm nor too sharp with the city's fumes. Archie had finished reading the Times and had made a pass through the mail, mostly bills, a solicitation from a publisher, and a postcard from a wine merchant Wolfe had dismissed years ago for inferior Riesling. Wolfe himself sat enthroned in the yellow chair, vast and immovable, as if the day existed only to preserve his bulk and his orchids. Across the hall in the kitchen, Fritz moved with the precision of a surgeon preparing for operation. He emerged presently, a stout wicker basket in hand, and Wolfe's folded grocery list secured atop it by a fountain pen. "Back by 11, Fritz said, his voice carrying a German lilt that made the promise sound like a vow. "There are fresh chanterelles if Mr. Wexler has not sold them all." Wolfe lifted a hand, palm downward, as if blessing the expedition. "See that he has not. I do not forgive failure in fungi." Archie rose from his desk. "I'll remind you, Fritz, that the sidewalks are slick. If you break your neck, we'll starve." Fritz smiled at the remark, though not warmly. He tucked his scarf in neat folds, set his hat firm against his brow, and went out the door, leaving behind the faint scent of cloves from his cologne. The door thudded shut, and the house settled into its customary silence. The morning stretched. Wolfe devoted 2 hours to orchids. I typed letters that would never be signed. By noon, the city outside hummed with horns and trolleys, and the sound rose faintly through the window panes. The clock marked 12:30, then 1. The chair creaked when Wolfe shifted, not because of nerves, but indigestion. At 2, I set down my pen. "He said 11, I observed. Wolfe's eyes closed briefly as if shutting me away. "So he did. He didn't say 3. "That is evident." I stood, walked to the window, and watched a delivery truck lumber past, its tyres spraying water left by a morning street cleaning. Fritz had never been careless with time. The man measured his hours as he measured flour. By 2:30, Wolfe's brows had formed a heavier line. "You're rattled," I said. "I am annoyed," Wolfe replied. His voice had weight, but not concern, at least not yet. "The routine is disturbed. Dinner will be insufferably delayed." I picked up the telephone and called Wexler's Market. A boy answered, his voice sharp and impatient. "He was here," the boy said. "Bought lamb shanks, paid in cash, left maybe 11:45. That was the last mark on Fritz's known path. I returned to the office. Wolfe had opened his eyes and was staring at the empty red leather chair where clients usually perched, twisting their hands in distress. Today, it sat unused. "Well," I said, "shall I phone hospitals?" "Wasteful," Wolfe muttered. "Fritz is orderly. If detained, it is deliberate." He tapped a finger against the armrest, each stroke slow. "Call Inspector Kramer. Inquire whether a man of Fritz's description has been discovered under disagreeable circumstances." I rang the precinct. Kramer was not pleased to be pulled from his duties by Nero Wolfe's secretary. "Goodwin, if this is another of your tricks." "Listen, Inspector. Our cook went out at 10. He hasn't returned. Market says he left before noon. It is now nearly 3. "You want the police to hunt a missing errand boy," Kramer growled. "Tell Wolfe to sit on his eggs." "Humour me," I said. "Run a check. German fellow, 50, short, neat moustache, basket in hand." Answered to Fritz. Kramer grumbled, but he agreed. "If we find him drunk in a saloon, you'll hear about it." When I set the receiver down, Wolfe's eyes had narrowed. He had drawn the grocery list from his vest pocket, where he had tucked a duplicate for reference. The page was folded precisely, ink bold, lines in Wolfe's square hand, lamb shanks, chanterelles, cream, leeks, saffron. Ordinary enough, except for the precision of the script. He studied it as if words might confess. He never lingered without cause, Wolfe said, half to himself. Something has intruded. By 4 o'clock the house felt cavernous. Without the sounds of chopping or the hiss of stock, silence spread like fog. I paced from desk to window and back again. Wolfe's patience thinned visibly, though he cloaked it in languor. He had eaten only bread and cheese at lunch, a poor meal by his standards, and he toyed with a glass of beer now, letting it sweat on the coaster. At 4:15 the telephone shrilled. I lifted the receiver. Kramer's voice carried a rougher edge. "Goodwin, we pulled a report. Body found behind Wexler's around noon. Not identified yet. Matches your cook's description. You'd better come down." I turned. Wolfe had not moved, but his eyes were on me. I covered the mouthpiece. "They found someone." Wolfe's jaw tightened. "Fritz?" "Could be." Wolfe closed his eyes again, not in dismissal this time, but in something heavier. "Attend, Archie. Ascertain. Bring facts, not speculation." I told Kramer I was on my way. When I hung up, Wolfe sat like a statue in that yellow chair, immovable, vast, his world cracked. The basket was gone, the list had become a relic, and the brownstone was no longer whole. I reached for my hat. Rain had started while I was in the cab, streaking the windshield with grey ribbons that blurred the lamplight. Midtown in late afternoon was a muddle of horns, streetcars grinding on the rails, and umbrellas bobbing like dark mushrooms along the pavements. The driver nosed his Packard past a fruit stand with canvas sagging from the drizzle, and then pulled up before Wexler's Gourmet Market, a place where Fritz had traded half his life for lamb shanks and mushrooms, fit for Wolfe's palate. The door was shut now, the windows dim, and a patrolman stood with arms folded, barring casual shoppers who might wander near. I stepped down, paid the fare, and ducked under the striped awning. The market smelled of wet sawdust, spoiled cabbage, and something metallic that hung thicker than rain. A sergeant in uniform gave me a slow eye and asked my name. I obliged, and he lifted the rope that stretched across the narrow alleyway. Inside the gloom of that passage, past a stack of wooden crates and a rubbish bin, lay Fritz Brenner. The sight of him stopped me. He was crumpled like discarded linen against the brick wall, hat knocked aside, scarf undone, wicker basket overturned. Rain had soaked the folded grocery list pinned to the basket rim. His spectacles were still in place, crooked, one lens smeared with dirt. His face, usually so composed in the kitchen's bright order, bore the waxy stillness of death. Around his neck, knotted cruelly, was the cord from the butcher's wrapping station, thick and stiff with damp. Inspector Kramer's voice carried down the alley. "I told them not to let you in, Goodwin." He was standing by a lamp-post, his coat collar up against the drizzle, fedora pulled low, cigar stub dark between his fingers. His bulk filled the space as he moved nearer, face red from weather and temper alike. "This isn't a spectacle for Wolfe's errand boy." I knelt beside the body, ignoring him. Fritz's hands were half-curled, nails broken slightly, as if he had clawed at the cord. The wicker basket contained only bruised leeks, a paper cone of mushrooms, and the duplicate list. The envelope Wolfe had sealed with cash was missing. I straightened and faced Kramer. "What do you say?" He jerked a thumb toward the alley's far end, where detectives sketched in notebooks and a photographer adjusted his flashbulb. "Robbery. He resisted, got himself strangled. Simple enough." Fritz carried just enough for the items on Wolfe's list, I said. It wasn't a banker's purse. "Cash is cash," Kramer growled. "Some punk saw a fat envelope and helped himself." Rain pooled in the grooves of the cobbles, and the flashbulb went off with a crack. The alley shuddered with white glare before sinking again into shadows. I walked a slow circle, studying the damp crates, the scattering of vegetable leaves, the wet cord at Fritz's throat. The knot was expert, double-twisted. It spoke of deliberation, not desperation. "Do you have the cord station checked?" I asked. Kramer's eyes narrowed. "Don't start, it's from inside. Anybody could have pulled it off the rack." "But not anybody ties it like that." I gestured at the neat double hitch. "That's not a street brawl's work." He shoved his hands into his coat pockets. "Goodwin, don't try me. This is police business. Wolfe can moan about his dinners, but he stays out of it." I bent to pick up the soaked grocery list. The ink had run, but Wolfe's blocky script remained legible. Lamb shanks, chanterelles, leeks, cream, saffron. Each word stood like a relic. Fritz would never have abandoned that list willingly. The sergeant muttered behind us. "No wallet either, Inspector, just the basket." Kramer scowled. "That confirms robbery." I shook my head. It confirms something was taken, yes. Fritz didn't walk these streets flaunting cash. Someone knew he carried an envelope and someone chose a cord, not a knife or a blackjack. That wasn't clumsy. Kramer spat into the gutter. "You'll spin any yarn to give Wolfe a stage. Well, he's not getting one." 2 uniforms lifted Fritz onto a stretcher. His hat rolled against the bricks, and I stooped to pick it up, brushing rain from the brim before placing it gently on his chest. For a man who had seasoned meals with exact pinches and lined shelves with jars polished like glassware, ending in a filthy alley seemed obscene. The stretcher moved past us, covered with a tarpaulin. I watched until it disappeared into the wagon. When I turned, Kramer was watching too, jaw clenched, though he'd never admit sympathy. "You'll tell Wolfe," he said. "But mark me, Goodwin, he sticks his nose in, I'll break it." I kept my voice even. "I'll tell him, yes. And I'll also tell him what I saw. That knot wasn't desperate, Inspector. It was tidy." He muttered a curse and stalked back to the waiting patrol car. I lingered a moment longer in the rain. The market windows flickered with electric light, casting reflections across the puddles. Passers-by craned necks, but the patrolman pushed them back. Midtown life went on, indifferent. A trolley bell clanged on the avenue. Somewhere inside me, annoyance coiled into anger. Fritz had served breakfasts and dinners with quiet mastery. He had been as fixed in the brownstone as Wolfe's yellow chair. Now he lay on a slab because someone had used a list and an envelope to bait him. I walked back toward the curb, flagged another cab and gave the driver Wolfe's address. The seat smelled of wet wool and the glass fogged from my breath. The streets blurred past, lamp glow against brick, neon signs for taverns and theatres, men hurrying with newspapers folded above their heads. At the brownstone I climbed the steps and unlocked the heavy door. The office smelled of leather and polish, steady as always. Wolfe sat immovable in the yellow chair, eyes shut, fingers steepled. When I entered, he opened them slowly. "Well?" he asked. I set my hat on the stand. It was Fritz. He did not move, only his mouth pressed into a thinner line. "Strangled," I said. "With a butcher's cord, behind Wexler's." Wolfe inhaled through the nose, deep, once. "Robbery?" "That's Kramer's line. But the envelope's gone, yes. Cash and list remained till rain ruined them." Wolfe reached for his glass of beer, lifted it and set it down untouched. "Inexcusable." "Kramer says keep out." He leaned back, eyes hooded. "This household has been violated. That man devoted his life to my table. He is irreplaceable." I watched him carefully. Wolfe's grief did not shout. It compressed, settled deep, and turned into iron. "What will you do?" I asked. He folded his hands again. "Attend to the details, Archie. Bring me every word, every breath. We shall answer this affront as one answers an insult, with reason, precision, and certainty. If Kramer objects, he may stew." The room was hushed. Outside, the rain pressed against the panes like a hand searching for entry. Fritz's absence filled the house more than his presence ever had. The red leather chair across from Wolfe stood empty, not with a client's nerves, but with the loss of a man who had belonged here. I lit the desk lamp, adjusted my notebook, and began. The rain had thinned by morning, leaving the streets washed but not cleansed. Manhattan's gutters steamed faintly where sunlight tried to cut through haze. I set out with Wolfe's orders to retrace Fritz's steps, though he never phrased it as such. He had only said, "Ascertain the route and the persons upon it. They will not volunteer the truth, so extract it," which was Wolfe's way of granting me liberty with shoe leather while he remained within his sacred square footage. The cab dropped me at 9th Avenue, where markets clung like barnacles to the city's appetite. The air was salted with brine from barrels of fish, and thick with the cry of vendors already haggling. I started at Carlo Vitanza's butcher shop, a narrow storefront whose windows displayed sides of beef and sausages looped like garlands. Inside, sawdust muffled the floor and the smell of iron and fat pressed close. Vitanza stood behind the counter, cleaver resting like a weapon of office. He was barrel-chested, hair slicked to a shine, with eyes that measured coin faster than cuts. He wiped his hands on a stained apron and looked at me without welcome. "You're Goodwin," he said. Word travelled quick. "I am. Fritz came here yesterday morning." His mouth tightened. "He did. Wanted lamb shanks. Paid. Left. That's all." I glanced at the block where cuts lay arranged in surgical neatness. "You didn't hear what happened?" "I heard. He chopped at a slab with the cleaver, more force than needed. Tragic. A good man." "He was strangled with cord like that." I gestured to the wrapping twine spool mounted near the counter. Vitanza paused. His jaw shifted as if chewing air. "That cord is for parcels. Anybody could take it." "You didn't see him after he left?" "No, I had customers." He spread his hands, broad and scarred. "I got nothing else." I leaned on the counter. "You've got debts, Vitanza, the kind that make men desperate. Did you think Fritz carried more than groceries?" His eyes flared, then cooled. "I don't touch friends. He was decent. Better than most of you." The cleaver thudded again, final as a gavel. I took the hint, but I left with the picture of a man pressed by creditors, whose temper could cut as sharp as his tools. From there, I walked east to Madison, where wealth bought delicacies by the pound. Mrs. Mildred Faraday lived in a brownstone trimmed in marble, with curtains heavy enough to keep sunlight unemployed. A maid answered, lips tight, and after a short delay admitted me to a parlour where Mrs. Faraday presided in an armchair that dwarfed her. She was in her late 60s, hair waved like frosting, jewels heavy enough to anchor her in place. On a tray beside her rested chocolates in silver wrappers and a glass of sherry, though it was not yet noon. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, voice rich as butter. "You've come about poor Fritz, I heard. Shocking. You saw him yesterday?" "Yes, at Wexler's. He was buying mushrooms. I complimented him on his basket." She smiled, though her lips didn't soften. He was always so polite, so precise, such a rarity in these times. "What did he say to you?" "That he was in a hurry. He seemed flustered, quite unlike him." "Flustered how?" She lifted a chocolate, examined it, then set it down again. "Distracted. Perhaps he had more errands than usual." "Did you follow him out?" "I did not. I had a driver waiting." She sipped her sherry with practiced poise. "Are you suggesting I could harm that gentleman? I adored him. He gave me a recipe for bœuf à la bourguignonne once. Divine." I studied her, the lace at her cuffs trembling faintly with each breath. "Fritz wasn't flustered often. Did he mention anything else?" "Only saffron. He said it was dear, but Mr. Wolfe insisted." She pressed her fingers together. Imagine, risking his life over groceries. Her tone carried more curiosity than grief. I left her parlour with the impression of appetite masquerading as affection. She collected delicacies as others collected paintings, and Fritz had been another of her rare finds. Next was Tommy Keegan, a delivery boy known to every grocer between 8th and 10th. He lurked by the loading dock behind Wexler's, cigarette dangling though he was hardly 17. Freckles spotted his face and his cap was pulled low. He sneered when he saw me approach. "You're Wolfe's man," he said. "Archie Goodwin. You knew Fritz." "Yeah, the kraut cook. Thought he was better than the rest." "Careful, kid." I stepped closer. "He's dead. Strangled. That amuse you?" The sneer faltered. "I didn't touch him. I just said he acted like he owned the place. Always picky, sending stuff back if it wasn't perfect." "He deserved perfect. You ever see him yesterday?" Tommy kicked at a crate. "Maybe. He passed me in the alley. Didn't look at me." "Did you follow?" He spat. "Why would I? I got runs to make. Anyway, I wouldn't waste cord on him. I'd use my fists." I reached out, snatched the cigarette from his lips, and crushed it under my heel. "If you remember more, you'll tell me. Otherwise, keep your hands clean." His glare burned, but beneath it flickered fear. Boys like him stole fruit or coins, not lives. Still, he had a temper, and the alley placed him near enough. Finally, I stepped inside Wexler's gourmet market. The bell over the door chimed, and the scent of spices and coffee washed over me. Counters gleamed with polish, glass jars stacked in orderly ranks. Behind the register stood Arnold Wexler himself, a lean man with thinning hair, spectacles glinting. His smile carried less welcome than calculation. "Mr. Goodwin, my condolences. Fritz was Particular. He was murdered behind your store, I said. Yes, an outrage. He adjusted his tie. We cooperated fully with the police. You and Fritz didn't always get along. Wexler's mouth twitched. He had standards. He believed my saffron inferior, my leeks too coarse, my butter unworthy. I tolerated it because Mr. Wolfe's patronage is substantial, but he was never satisfied. You saw him yesterday? Briefly. He bought cream, then he left. Anything unusual? Wexler hesitated, then shook his head. No, except he checked his list twice, as though something puzzled him. I leaned on the counter. What might puzzle Fritz about a list written by Wolfe? Wexler spread his hands. I wouldn't know. Perhaps Wolfe asked for something rare. He muttered about grains of paradise, a spice hardly common. That was the first I'd heard of it. Wolfe hadn't mentioned it when showing me the duplicate list. I filed it, careful not to betray reaction. I thanked Wexler and stepped back onto the street. The markets bustled, oblivious to the absence of one man who had walked them daily. Rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with damp and smoke from chimneys. I flagged a cab for the brownstone where Wolfe awaited my report. Inside the office, the yellow chair received him like a throne. He listened as I described each stop, each face, each word. When I mentioned Vitanza's debts, Wolfe's lids lowered. At Mrs. Faraday's flustered remark, he grunted. Tommy's presence in the alley earned a scowl. But when I reached Wexler and his mention of grains of paradise, Wolfe opened his eyes fully, as though the orchids upstairs had wilted at once. That spice was not on my list, he said. Then why did Fritz carry it in his head? He did not. Someone altered perception, or the list itself. The room settled into silence. Fritz's empty kitchen rattled in memory. 4 suspects stood in line, each with motive, each with chance, but none obvious as murderer. Wolfe closed his eyes again, murmuring, "Attend, Archie. Attend closely." I sharpened my pencil and waited. The market had given me faces and hints. Wolfe would make them yield. The city had not yet dried from the previous night's rain. Streets carried the sheen of oil upon water, and the air smelled of coal smoke and damp brick. I returned to Wexler's alley with Wolfe's instructions stiff in my pocket. The police had cleared the body hours earlier, but traces lingered. Chalk marks on cobbles, the sour tang of blood in rain, a scrap of paper pressed against the wall where water had failed to dislodge it. I bent and lifted the scrap. It was Fritz's grocery list, folded once, now a damp ruin of smudged ink and crumpled edges. Wolfe's square handwriting stood out despite the rain. Several lines were slashed through with Fritz's customary stroke, recording items already bought. Lamb shanks and chanterelles were crossed, as were cream and leeks. One word, however, remained untouched, circled deliberately in blue pencil. Grains of paradise. The circle was bold, pressed hard enough to indent the paper. I turned the list under weak daylight, puzzled. I'd seen Wolfe's duplicate earlier, locked in his vest pocket. This spice had not been written there. Wolfe never allowed alterations without his say. Fritz, loyal to his marrow, would not have invented additions. My reflection in the rain puddle blurred as Kramer's voice carried down the alley. "Goodwin, you're poking around again. Thought I told you to keep out." He strode nearer, coat collar up, hat brim dripping. 2 detectives followed with notebooks. He reached me, looked at the sodden list in my hand, and grunted. "What's that?" "Fritz's list. Found it here." I held it up. He squinted. "So, a list of groceries. Doesn't take Philo Vance to figure it." I tapped the circled word. "Wolfe never asked for this spice. It's rare. Why circle it?" Kramer's lip curled. "You think a spice killed him? He got jumped. The punk saw cash, took it, left him cold." I folded the paper carefully. Fritz never circled items. He crossed them once purchased. This was planted. "Planted." He laughed without humour. "You'll say next it's a code. Spare me." I slipped the list into my pocket. "I'll show it to Wolfe. He'll decide if it's a code or a grocery." "Listen," Kramer snapped. "You feed Wolfe any fancy theories and he'll send me a mountain of typewritten insults. Save us both trouble." "Can't promise, Inspector." He muttered and waved me off, but his eyes lingered longer than his scoff admitted. At the precinct, Fritz's belongings had been catalogued. With Wolfe's written demand in hand, I persuaded a clerk to surrender them. The wicker basket, damp but intact, sat beside me. Inside were bruised vegetables, a cone of mushrooms turned dark, and a folded scrap the size of a ticket. I drew it out. It was a receipt. Wexler's heading ran across the top, ornate script with address and telephone. Below, the items: cream, saffron, and, oddly, powdered mace. The date was stamped yesterday, the hour 11:30. Total, $3.70, paid in cash. I frowned. Powdered mace had not been on the list, not on Wolfe's copy, not on the ruined one. Fritz would never buy it unasked. I carried basket and papers back to the brownstone. The office smelled of leather and polish. Wolfe sat in the yellow chair, vast and still, eyes closed as if in communion with the air. When I entered, he stirred, raising his lids with effort. "Well?" I set the basket on the desk. "Recovered from the precinct, and this." I laid the receipt before him. He reached without rising, fingers heavy but precise. His eyes narrowed as he read. Mace. Unspeakable. Fritz despised mace. "It wasn't on your list," I said. He drew the duplicate list from his pocket and compared. No. Cream, yes. Saffron, yes. Mace, never. I unfolded the crumpled sheet. This was at the alley. Several crossed off, one circled. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the circled word. For a moment, silence thickened the air. Then he exhaled, slow and controlled. Abominable. "What do you make of it?" He tapped the indentation left by Fritz's pencil. "Fritz never circled. He struck items when acquired. This circle is alien." "Meaning someone tampered?" "Yes. Either before he left here, which is impossible, or after he departed, which is likely. Someone induced him to buy a thing not on my list." Kramer's boots thudded in the hallway. He entered uninvited, hat dripping on the rug. "I warned you, Goodwin. Now Wolfe's chewing on spices." Wolfe ignored him. "Inspector, this word, grains of paradise, does not belong. My cook would not have dared add it. That receipt proves he was persuaded to purchase mace as well. Both suggest interference." Kramer sneered. "So a thief asked him to buy mace, then strangled him with butcher's cord. What's next? He was murdered by saffron." Wolfe's eyes opened fully, dark as cellars. "You reduce evidence to ridicule because it inconveniences you. That is the habit of the lazy." Kramer's face reddened. "Don't try me, Wolfe. The man was robbed. End of story." I stepped between them. "The receipt was in his pocket, Inspector. If he was robbed, why leave it?" Kramer jabbed a finger. "Because thieves don't care about slips of paper. They want cash." "Then why take the cash envelope and leave the basket with leeks and cream?" Fritz's basket was intact except for the missing envelope. He ground his teeth, then turned toward the door. "Keep your theories, but if Wolfe interferes, I'll haul him down myself." When he had gone, Wolfe shifted his bulk. "Archie, attend. Whoever inserted those items required Fritz to ask questions. He would not know where to find grains of paradise. He would inquire, thus drawing notice, thus placing himself in peril." "Meaning someone used him as bait." "Precisely." The clock ticked. Rain tapped against the glass. The room felt hollow without Fritz's clatter from the kitchen. Wolfe rested his eyes again. "You will determine who desired this spice. Then we shall know who desired Fritz silenced." I tucked the papers into my notebook. The list crinkled, damp and accusing, its circled word standing like a scar. The brownstone had never felt so empty, though nothing in it had changed. The rugs were still thick beneath the feet, the books still lined in disciplined rows, the orchids upstairs still drinking their warmth. Yet the rhythm had gone, the steady cadence of knives against wood, pans hissing, the careful footfall of a man whose life had been ordered by meals. Without Fritz, the silence was not peace but vacancy, and it pressed against the walls like fog trapped indoors. Breakfast was a grim parody. I had boiled eggs, charred toast, and coffee bitter enough to scour a man's tongue. Wolfe sat at the dining table in his robe, gazing at the plate as though it had offended him by existing. He lifted his fork, jabbed once, then pushed the dish away. "This is unpardonable," he muttered. "It's what we've got," I said, "unless you've been hiding a second cook in the cellar." He glared at the toast as though sheer will might transform it into brioche. Fritz's absence is not merely inconvenience, it is mutilation. The word hung heavy, and I let it sit. Wolfe drank half his coffee, grimaced, and rose without finishing. He retreated to the office, leaving me to scrape the plates into the bin. The clatter was sharper than it should have been, echoing against the stillness. By mid-morning he was at the desk, a book unopened before him, while I sorted through correspondence. The scent of orchids drifted faintly down the stairwell, but he did not speak of them. His eyes followed nothing in particular, and I caught him once rubbing his thumb against the armrest as though feeling the grain of wood could anchor him. "Wolfe," I said finally, "he'd have hated you starving yourself." He lifted his gaze, slow as turning a wheel. "I am not starving. I am denied." The telephone rang, breaking the moment. It was Kramer, his tone as gruff as gravel. He wanted to confirm details of Fritz's errands, impatient with Wolfe's theories about lists and spices. I passed the receiver across. Wolfe listened, eyes half closed, and when Kramer finished his tirade, Wolfe replied in one clipped sentence, "You are a dolt." Then he set the receiver down and closed his eyes again. Lunch was worse. I attempted stew with what remained in the larder. The meat was tough, the carrots limp, and Wolfe abandoned it after 2 bites. He wiped his mouth with care, then said in a tone as calm as stone, "This house will not survive long without restoration." "Then we restore it," I answered, "by finding who tore it apart." That evening, lamplight cast long shadows across the office. Outside, fog pressed thick against the glass, muting the horns of cabs on the avenue. Wolfe sat in the yellow chair, a glass of beer untouched beside him. I leaned against the desk, watching him brood, his massive form rigid with more than indigestion. "You're carrying grief like it's gout," I said, pretending it's only routine. He opened his eyes, dark and sharp. "Archie, restraint is not pretense. The man served me 20 years. He ordered this household as surely as I did. His death is a violation, and violations must be avenged." "That's the Wolfe I know," I said. His voice deepened. "We will find who defiled him. Not for law, not for Kramer, but for Fritz. His dignity demands it." The clock struck 8. The kitchen remained silent. No clang of pans, no aroma of simmering stock. The absence was a wound. Wolfe leaned back, steepled his fingers, and closed his eyes once more, but I saw how his breath thickened, how irritation had been fashioned into armour. I left him to it, but as I climbed the stairs, the silence followed. The brownstone had lost its pulse, and until we solved the crime, none of us would eat well again. The next morning, the city wore its usual mask of noise and smoke, though I had begun to notice the seams. A trolley clanged along 9th Avenue. Horns bleated like sheep, and yet all of it felt staged, as if Manhattan itself knew Fritz had gone and was pretending business as usual. Wolfe had planted me with instructions, as exacting as any military order, to dig into the 4 names orbiting Fritz's last hours. He wanted facts, not flourishes, and he wanted them before the house collapsed into boiled eggs and melancholy forever. I started with Carlo Vitanza, the butcher with a temper. His shop was open early, sawdust sprinkled fresh, the air thick with iron and fat. A pair of men in broad lapels loitered near the door, their whispers cutting off when I entered. Vitanza looked up from his block, cleaver raised and his smile strained. "Back again, Goodwin. You buying lamb or suspicion?" "Neither," I said. "Though suspicion's on offer free of charge. Who were your visitors?" He jerked his chin toward the door. "Customers." They didn't smell of customers, more like creditors. His eyes narrowed, and the cleaver landed hard, splitting bone with a crack. "What I owe is my affair." "Not if it puts Fritz in an alley." He slammed the cleaver flat. "I told you I respected that man. He knew meat like scripture." "Yet you were heard arguing with loan sharks yesterday morning near the market." His face reddened. "So what? They want payment. I said I'd find it. That's life." "Convenient that Fritz ends up strangled with cord from your trade." He gripped the block until his knuckles blanched. "You think I'd waste rope on him? I'd sooner cut my own hand." I let silence grow, then asked, "Where were you at 11? "In the shop. Ask my assistant. He saw me all morning." I left him to his carcasses, though the sweat at his temples said more than words. His debts hung like knives overhead, and desperation makes men clumsy, but Wolfe would demand method, not motive. From there I walked to Park Avenue, where Mrs. Mildred Faraday's world was padded in velvet. Her parlour smelled of rosewater and stale smoke from a fire too often stoked. She greeted me in black silk, her hands loaded with rings that clicked softly when she gestured. "Mr. Goodwin," she said, voice smooth as buttercream. "You returned so soon. Have you found poor Fritz's killer?" "Not yet," I replied, "but you might help me. You claim to adore him." Her eyes shone faintly. I did. He was an artist. He gave me recipes, precious as jewels. I copied them into my book. "You borrowed recipes from him," I said. "Which ones?" "Bouillabaisse, cassoulet, even his method for liver pâté. I keep them all. Such generosity." "Did you share them?" She laughed lightly. "Of course not. They are mine now, a treasure." I leaned forward. "And yesterday, after you saw him at Wexler's, where did you go?" "My driver took me home, straight here. I never left until evening." "Anyone else in the car?" "Only the chauffeur. He will vouch." I studied her, the tremor in her jeweled fingers, the eagerness with which she spoke Fritz's name. Affection, yes, but also possession. She adored him as she adored truffles and wines, objects to hoard, not people to mourn. Back on the street, I cut through an alley where delivery carts rattled. There I found Tommy Keegan, cap low, freckles bold, lugging a crate of oranges. He scowled when I blocked his way. "Goodwin, you hounded me yesterday. What now?" "You were seen in the alley where Fritz died." His jaw tightened. "I told you I passed him. That's all." "Not what I heard. A grocer's boy swore you lingered there half an hour." He kicked the crate against the wall. "So what? I take breaks where I like. Doesn't make me a killer." "You've got a temper, Tommy. Fritz was strict. Maybe you hated him for it." His face flushed. He acted high and mighty, always correcting me, saying I bruised fruit I stacked wrong. Yeah, I cursed him, but I didn't kill him. "Where were you at 11? "With the truck, making runs. Ask Mr. Wexler. He had me carting crates to the cellar." "Then you were at Wexler's while Fritz shopped." He bit his lip, realizing he had tied himself closer. "That doesn't mean anything." I left him seething, but the time and place were damning. My last stop was Wexler's own office, tucked behind polished counters where clerks fussed with tins. He received me in shirt sleeves, spectacles low, ledger open. His manner was brittle courtesy. "Goodwin," he said, "I assure you my store is blameless." "I'll decide that. May I see your books?" He hesitated, then slid the ledger across. Columns of figures ran down neat lines, but Wolfe had trained me well enough to sniff rot. Purchases didn't match sales. Imports were listed twice. Prices shifted oddly. "Careless math," I remarked. He bristled. "Clerical error, nothing more." "Wolfe will see fraud here. If you skimmed, Fritz might have noticed." "He knew too much," Wexler snapped, then caught himself. "I mean, he was particular." "Particular enough to die for it?" His hand trembled as he pushed his glasses up. "No. He left with his basket. That's all." I closed the ledger. "Inspector Kramer might like a look." His face drained. "You wouldn't, unless you help me. Did you see Fritz unsettled?" He swallowed. "Yes." He checked his list, muttered about something strange. He asked about grains of paradise. I told him I had none. He frowned, then left. That tied the knot tighter. The list again. Always the list. When I returned to the brownstone, the office was heavy with lamplight, dust motes drifting like ghosts. Wolfe sat immense in his chair, beer within reach, eyes fixed on nothing. I delivered my findings, one by one. Vitanza drowning in debts, quarrelling with sharks. Mrs. Faraday hoarding recipes like relics. Tommy Keegan loitering in the death alley, his alibi thin as broth. Wexler's books crooked as a dog's hind leg. Every one of them frayed at the edges. Wolfe absorbed in silence. At last he said, "Motive is the province of poets. Method, Archie, method. Which hand could have tied that knot? Which mind altered the list? We must seek craft, not quarrels." His eyes opened fully, dark and hard. "Attend the details. Who had skill? Who had chance? Who left trace? That will tell us more than grievances." I nodded, pencil ready. Outside, the city went on clattering. Inside, the circle tightened. The basket had been returned from the precinct with its contents tagged and docketed, but I had the privilege of looking through it with better eyes than theirs. The vegetables sagged, The mushrooms blackened at the edges, the cream soured in its bottle. Beneath them lay a paper envelope, heavy stock, folded once. It bore Wolfe's wax seal, though cracked, and had been stuffed with sheets cut neatly but blank. I lifted it and held it to the lamplight. The thickness was right, the weight convincing, but Wolfe's seal had been pressed against nothing. I carried it into the office. Wolfe sat in his yellow chair, hands pressed together at his chin. He watched me without comment as I laid the envelope on the desk. "This came back in the basket," I said, "sealed with your crest. Inside," I shook out the contents. Sheets of blank foolscap scattered across the blotter. His gaze sharpened. "That is not the envelope I entrusted Fritz." "You're certain?" Am I uncertain of my own hand? I sealed a packet containing cash sufficient for his purchases. I folded the bills and pressed wax with my signet. "That," he pointed, "is a counterfeit." "Neat work," I admitted. "Whoever planted it knew how to mimic." He lifted a sheet, rubbed it between his fingers, then dropped it with disgust. "Pulp paper. Worthless." I sat. "So the question, did the killer want money, or did he want whatever they thought you'd hidden in the envelope?" Wolfe's eyes closed. "Your phrasing presumes intention beyond theft. That must be proved." Before I could argue, the doorbell rang. A moment later, Inspector Kramer entered without waiting for an invitation, hat dripping, jaw set for war. "You again," he barked. "What new nonsense?" I gestured at the desk. "Fritz's envelope. Only it isn't. Cash gone, blank pages left." Kramer snorted. "Thieves switch envelopes every day." He resisted. They made a fool of him. That's all. "Except Wolfe swears that's not his seal." Kramer leaned close, squinting. "Looks like it to me." Wolfe rumbled. "Inspector, you are as blind as you are obstinate. That wax is mine, pressed from a stolen signet. But the crease of the fold differs, and Fritz never placed blank paper in anything." Kramer waved his hand. "Meaningless. You're twisting trifles." "Trifles," Wolfe said, "constitute facts when arranged." Kramer turned to me. "Don't let him drag you into another circus, Goodwin. Stick to sense." I didn't answer. My hand was inside the basket again, finding a smaller scrap tucked between the bruised leaks. A sliver of paper bore inked initials. TK. I held it up. Kramer grinned triumphantly. "There, proof enough. Tommy Keegan leaves his mark and your cook dies, case closed." I frowned. "Too neat. A folded scrap with initials lying in plain sight. Tommy's dumb, not suicidal." "He was seen near the alley," Kramer snapped. "Now his initials turn up in the basket. Open your eyes." Wolfe's lids lifted. His tone was flat as granite. "Archie, disregard this artifice." I looked at him. "You think it's planted?" "Assuredly. Who profits by so crude a trail? Not the boy. He lacks wit. This was arranged to direct suspicion, and only the stupid would be misled." Kramer bristled. "Are you calling me stupid?" "Yes," Wolfe said simply. Kramer flushed, jammed his hat on, and stalked out, muttering about warrants. The slam of the door rattled the glass. I turned back to Wolfe. "All right, so we discount the initials. But that still leaves the envelope. Someone risked forging your seal. Why? Unless they thought you had more than cash in it." He shifted, the chair creaking under his bulk. "Precisely. It was meant to suggest that Fritz carried something significant. Correspondence, secrets, perhaps a list. When his corpse was discovered, the substitution would confound. The truth is simpler. Fritz carried only money. The deception was deliberate." "Then the killer knew enough about you to counterfeit your mark." "Yes, and enough to understand that a forged list or letter would entangle Fritz with questions he could not answer. Thus, he was placed in jeopardy." I leaned back, pencil tapping the notebook. "So we hunt not for a thief, but for someone with imagination." "Correct." "Still," I said, "I'll press Keegan. Even if he didn't plant the scrap, someone wanted us to think he did." "Do so," Wolfe allowed, "but hold your judgment. The boy is a pawn. The player remains concealed." The lamplight pooled on the blotter, gleaming against the false envelope and the scattered blank sheets. The room smelled faintly of beer, untouched at Wolfe's elbow. Outside, the fog muffled the horns of cabs. Inside, Wolfe's voice fell to a murmur. "Archie, Fritz died because of me, because someone desired to use my name, my seal, my authority. We shall uncover who, and they shall learn the folly of trifling with me. I gathered the papers, slid them into my case. The false trail pointed one way, Wolfe's certainty another. Between them lay the truth, waiting. The orchid rooms were thick with warmth and moisture, glass panes fogged from the heat of pipes running beneath the benches. Rows of pots stretched in careful ranks, each bloom trained and coaxed under Wolfe's eye with the devotion he rarely gave to people. I had followed him up at 9 sharp, more to keep him from sulking than for any interest in petals. He moved slowly among the benches, touching a leaf here, adjusting a shade there, the great dome of his head gleaming faintly in the steamy air. I leaned against the doorframe. "You don't look like a man tending flowers. You look like a man rehearsing an argument." His lips pressed tight. An argument, yes, with fate. He plucked a withered blossom, examined it, and let it fall. These plants obey their nature. They bloom, they fade, they do not deceive. "Unlike people," I said. "Unlike people," he echoed. He straightened and placed both hands behind his back. "Archie, it is intolerable. The theft, the substitution, the blank envelope, each was clumsy, but the list—" He paused, eyes narrowing. "The list was clever." I stepped inside, the boards creaking beneath me. "You've been circling that word for days. What about the list exactly?" He gestured toward the rows as though blossoms might confirm his logic. "Lists are order, they govern. Fritz's discipline was absolute. He never deviated, never added. For a foreign item to appear, grains of paradise, it was not chance, it was inserted." I nodded. "But if the killer wanted cash, why not just rob him? Why the spice?" He exhaled, heavy as the steam in the room. "Because money was not the object. That word was bait. Whoever placed it knew it would jar him, knew he would seek explanation. Fritz was dutiful. He would ask, inquire, probe. That inquiry drew attention. It placed him under a lens, and under that lens he was extinguished." I frowned. "So he was killed not for what he had, but for what he carried on paper?" "Precisely. The envelope with blank sheets was stagecraft. The planted scrap with initials, more theatre. The list, however, was the true instrument. It lured him." I thought it over. "Then the killer wasn't after Fritz. He was after you." His head inclined slightly, acknowledging without pride. "Yes. The choice of spice proves it. No man of common appetite would request it. Only one who understood my palate, my obsession, would select it. They aimed through him at me." The orchids hung silent, their petals like listening ears. I felt the weight of his words settle. "Then we've been chasing debtors and delivery boys, when the motive sits in your study." "Method, Archie," he corrected softly. "Always method. Fritz was methodical. His death was engineered through method. Not passion, not desperation. A calculated insertion." I rubbed the condensation from a pane. Outside, the city was a blur of grey rooftops and chimney smoke. "Who gains by baiting you?" His mouth tightened. "That is the heart. Whoever forged the list wanted me unsettled, dragged into their design. They sought to provoke, to draw me out. Well, they succeeded." He turned, his bulk filling the aisle. "Then they will regret it, because in using Fritz they erred. They underestimated the bond of this house." The air smelled of damp earth and blossoms. His voice, though calm, carried iron. "We will answer not with rage, but with arrangement. I shall shape their trap into mine." I nodded slowly. So the rare spice wasn't seasoning, it was signal. Yes, a signal to me, disguised as an errand for him. And now we must discern who dared send it. The greenhouse hissed with steam, and Wolfe bent again over his orchids, but his mind was no longer among them. It had fixed on the invisible hand that had written a single word to end a man's life and provoke another into pursuit. It was past noon when I traced the rumour to a warehouse on the East River. The fog off the water clung to the piers, and gulls screamed overhead, their cries sharper than the whine of winches hauling crates. I'd been following a whisper that Mrs. Faraday's appetite for rare delicacies exceeded even what legal importers could provide. Wexler's name had surfaced too often for coincidence, and the trail had the smell of something packed in ice and shipped under false papers. Inside, the warehouse air was thick with tar and fish oil. Crates stamped with foreign lettering were stacked high, some bearing labels for canned olives, others for anchovies, though their weight suggested heavier secrets. A clerk with ink-stained fingers kept ledgers on a stand. I watched from behind a stack until a delivery truck pulled up, and from it stepped a driver carrying a wooden case. The stenciled mark read wine vinegar, but the careful way it was handled said Bordeaux or Burgundy. I slipped closer. "Put it with the Faraday order," the clerk muttered. That was confirmation enough. I waited until the driver left, then approached, badge of Wolfe's office displayed as if it were a police credential. The clerk squinted, but fear beat suspicion. "Faraday," I said. "She buys through you." He swallowed. "We handle consignments. Not my concern who signs." "You'll make it your concern, unless you want Kramer sniffing around here." That loosened his tongue. The shipments came monthly under false invoices. Wines, cheeses, spices, all rationed or taxed beyond reach. Mrs. Faraday received hers in crates marked linen or lamp oil. Wexler arranged the papers, using suppliers overseas who owed him favours. Fritz, with his meticulous nose for ingredients, had begun asking too many questions about saffron and butter that didn't pass inspection. He could tell Spanish from French by aroma, and his remarks had unsettled the merchants. I copied details in my notebook, then left the warehouse with the stink of contraband clinging to my coat. At the brownstone, the office was lit against the grey afternoon. Wolfe sat with a volume of Pliny open before him, but his eyes were not on the text. He looked up as I entered, and I laid the notebook on his desk. "Faraday and Wexler are tied," I said. "Smuggling, forged invoices, restricted goods coming through the docks." Fritz sniffed it out. Wolfe's fingers drummed once on the cover of the book. "Describe." I did, from the crates to the ledger entries. His mouth drew tighter with each detail. "So," he said finally, "they risked law for delicacies, gluttony and fraud." "And Fritz threatened them without knowing," I added. "He could expose them merely by tasting." Wolfe closed the book. Tempting to believe they silenced him for that. "Fits the bill. He sees too much. They panic, rope around the neck." He shook his head. "No, panic leaves rough edges. Fritz was killed by deliberation, not frenzy. The forged list, the substituted envelope, those are not the acts of a smuggler fearing discovery. They are orchestration." "Still," I said, "the conspiracy gives motive. Kramer will eat it up." "Kramer eats what is placed before him," Wolfe replied dryly. "We must distinguish menu from meal. Smuggling explains corruption, yes, but murder by forged grocery list? No. That is another course entirely." The evening meal was another travesty. Eggs again, with bread too stale for decency. Wolfe endured 2 bites before setting his fork down. His eyes lingered on the empty chair at the table. "Archie," he said, "Fritz knew of their fraud, but that knowledge alone did not kill him. Someone used the smuggling as smoke, not fire. Consider who benefits by disguising intent beneath this gourmet conspiracy." I nodded. "So Faraday and Wexler may be crooked, but they're not the finish line." "Correct. They are accompaniments. The entree remains hidden." The fog thickened outside, horns muffled along the avenue, the city pressing close. Wolfe sat heavy with thought, lips tight, and the absence of Fritz's sure hand in the kitchen weighed on us both. The conspiracy had opened, wide and stinking, but it was only garnish to a darker dish. The morning was grey with drizzle, the kind of weather that soaked without thunder or flash, just the steady weeping of the city against its own bricks. I had stepped from a cab near the grocer's alley when I heard the scrape of a broom. A man in city overalls, cap low, pushed wet rubbish toward the gutter. His shoulders bent with routine, but his eyes darted toward me when I asked, "You were here the day the cook was found?" He nodded once, suspicion thick in his stare. "I clean this stretch every day. Tuesday too. Saw him then." "You saw Fritz?" "Small man, basket on his arm. He was talking with another fellow, quarrelling." My pulse tightened. "Describe the fellow." Grey hat pulled down low, heavy shoulders, stood close like he didn't care who watched. I waited until the broom scraped again. "What time?" "Little after 11. I remember because the trolley clanged at the corner just then. They argued, then the cook walked deeper in. The other man followed a bit, then turned off, that's all. The details stuck like a burr. A grey hat, heavy shoulders. I'd seen one like it behind a butcher's counter. Carlo Vitanza. I left the sweeper to his broom and headed for 9th Avenue. Vitanza's shop was open, meat laid out on marble, hooks heavy with sausages. The sawdust was fresh, but the smell of iron lingered. He looked up as I entered, his cleaver poised over a slab. "You again," he said, forcing a smile. "Yes, again, and again, until I get the truth." He slammed the cleaver into the block, leaving it there like a flag. "I told you everything. He bought lamb. He left." "Try again. A witness saw you with him near the alley. Grey hat, your build, your time." His eyes flicked, then steadied. "Witnesses see what they like. This one swept streets, not lies. You argued with him." He pulled the cleaver free, wiped it, set it aside. "All right, I met him, but only for a word. That's no crime." What kind of word makes a man walk into an alley and not walk out? His jaw flexed. He busied himself wrapping chops for a customer who had wandered in. When she left, he turned back, voice low. He was asking about something he shouldn't. Said a name on his list was wrong. My pencil scratched. "A name?" He shook his head. "I don't know which. He only said it wasn't yours. He said someone tampered. He asked me who would dare. I told him to watch himself." And then I went back to my counter. He walked away. That was the end for me. "Until he turned up dead with cord from your trade." He snapped. "I didn't kill him. I've enough trouble with my own debts. Why would I add murder?" The sweat at his temples said he had more to tell, but fear cinched his tongue. I left him with his meat and his ghosts. Back at the brownstone, the office smelled faintly of beer and polish. Wolfe sat massive in the yellow chair, eyes shut, fingers steepled. I relayed the sweeper's words and Vitanza's reluctant admission. "So," Wolfe murmured, "Fritz knew a name was false." "Seems that way. He thought someone tampered." Wolfe opened his eyes. "That confirms my judgment. He was lured by the list, not robbed by chance. Vitanza corroborates what reason already proved. But if Fritz saw the change, why not come back here? Because duty drove him forward. He wished to complete the errand, then confront me with proof. He did not live to return." I leaned against the desk. "So the butcher's hat ties him to the scene, but his story shifts blame back to the list. You want me to press harder?" Wolfe closed his eyes again. "Yes. Strip away their excuses. Probe until method emerges. The knot at his throat, the forged seal, the alien spice, each is deliberate. Find whose hand moves with such craft. Do not be distracted by hunger, greed, or debt. Attend to method, Archie. Always method." The lamplight flickered as a draught stirred the curtains. Outside, the fog pressed closer, muting horns and footsteps. Inside, Wolfe's voice dropped to a growl. "They killed him by deception. They altered what was mine, placed it in his hand, and made him their instrument. For that, they shall answer." I wrote the words down, not for record, but to remind myself. The trap had not been sprung for Fritz alone. It had been set for Wolfe, baited with a list, executed with precision. And somewhere behind the veil of suspects, one hand tightened the cord with method enough to silence a cook and challenge a mind that never forgave insult. The brownstone was hushed, heavy with the absence that had settled since Fritz's death. Rain tapped faintly on the panes, and the hall smelled of damp wool from coats hung near the door. I'd been turning over the puzzle of the list until my head ached, and Wolfe's instruction, "Examine, Archie, do not speculate," nagged like a splinter. So I went where Fritz had lived his habits, the kitchen. The room was orderly still, though without his hand it felt abandoned. Copper pots gleamed from hooks, knives aligned like soldiers across a magnetic strip. Drawers were neat, linen folded, jars labelled. Yet the stillness was wrong, as though every surface waited for the man who would never return. I began to open cupboards, then drawers, moving with the unease of trespass. In the third drawer down, beneath folded towels, my fingers struck stiff paper. I drew it out. It was a list, written in Wolfe's square, uncompromising hand. The ink was dry, unblurred, unhandled. Items: lamb shanks, chanterelles, leeks, cream, saffron. 5 lines only. Nothing more. No circle, no exotic spice, no grains of paradise. I stood with it beneath the dim bulb, heart beating hard. This was the real list, untouched at the bottom of Fritz's drawer, which meant the crumpled sheet found on his body, rain-stained and marked with that alien spice, was counterfeit. I carried it upstairs at once. Wolfe was in the office, massive as ever in the yellow chair, eyes closed. I laid the list on the desk without a word, his lids lifted and his gaze fixed. "Where," he asked softly, "did you find it?" "In his kitchen drawer, buried under towels, untouched since you wrote it." He lifted it, studied the strokes. His finger moved down the 5 lines, pausing at each, then he set it flat again. "This is my hand. It is unaltered." And the one from the alley wasn't. It carried the spice. Someone forged it. His nostrils flared. Not forged my hand. I would recognize any counterfeit, but written anew, as if from instruction, and placed upon him, a substitution. I sat. So they planted a new list, one he carried into the market. Fritz thought it was yours. He never questioned. Fritz, Wolfe said slowly, never questioned my instruction. That was his virtue, and his doom. The lamplight burned low, casting shadows deep against the shelves. I felt the weight of the revelation settle like stone. Then he wasn't killed for chance or robbery. He was baited, deliberately led into inquiries about a spice he never meant to buy. "Precisely," Wolfe replied. "Opportunity did not kill him. Premeditation did." I poured 2 fingers of rye for myself, though Wolfe waved his hand in disdain. He leaned back, massive head tilted, eyes hooded. "Archie, consider what that demands. The killer had access to my list, or knowledge enough to imitate its form. They chose an item absurd to Fritz's understanding, certain it would unsettle him. They knew his loyalty would drive him to ask and thus expose himself. Which means, I said, this wasn't a butcher's grudge or a boy's temper. It was designed. Indeed, the method was the murder. The knot at his throat, the seal on the false envelope, the circled spice, all were instruments of artifice. Our adversary arranges illusions, not accidents. The words hung heavy. Outside, a trolley bell clanged faintly through the fog. I asked, "So what now? We know the forgery exists. How do we tie it to a hand?" He closed his eyes. "You will press the suspects again. Probe not their passions, but their craft. Who among them possesses the skill to compose such a substitution, to alter lists, to counterfeit seals? Seek handwriting, habits, slips of tongue. Seek precision. This was not the work of ignorance. And if Kramer insists on robbery, he will insist. He is obstinate. Let him. We will uncover truth while he blunders after trifles." The fire in the grate popped, sending sparks upward. Wolfe opened his eyes again, and for the first time since Fritz's death, they burned with more than grief. They murdered Fritz with a list. They dared to tamper with my order, to sully his obedience. That is affront, Archie, and affront I do not abide. I leaned forward. Then we hunt deliberate malice, not chance. Exactly. We have moved from shadow into outline. Now we must supply the detail. The room was still, save the rain and the clock. I gathered the true list, slipped it into my notebook. Its neat 5 lines glared like accusation. Wolfe sat silent, a mountain of flesh and thought, and I knew the case had shifted. Fritz had not died for money, nor for error, but for design, and design could be traced. The evening air pressed damp against the brownstone, fog curling in from the river, dulling the lamps along 35th Street. Inside, the office was lit with steady lamplight, brass polished, rugs thick, the red leather chairs arranged in a semicircle before Wolfe's throne of a chair. I'd set them myself, and I knew in an hour they would be filled with nerves, tempers, and lies. Wolfe sat already in place, vast bulk secure, eyes closed in a semblance of repose. He looked less like a man waiting for company than a mountain that had been there forever. "I trust," he murmured, "that you extended the invitations with the urgency they deserve." "They'll be here," I told him. Vitanza grumbled. Faraday preened. Wexler looked ready to faint and Keegan spat. Kramer cursed but promised to attend, mainly to keep you from making fools of his men again. Wolfe's lids lifted. "Good. Let them stew together. Heat will soften their masks." I poured myself a drink and waited. The clock ticked past 7. Outside, wheels clattered faintly over wet pavement. Then the bell rang. I answered the door to Carlo Vitanza, his shoulders square under a worn coat. Hat brim low, he smelled of raw meat and sawdust. "Goodwin," he said, gruff. "This better not be a trick." "It's a gathering," I replied. "Try not to mistake it for a hanging." He scowled and stepped inside. I guided him to a chair. Minutes later, Mrs. Faraday arrived, wrapped in mink despite the damp, her jewels glinting like small suns. She held her head high, perfume trailing behind her, lips pursed in practiced sorrow. "I could not refuse Mr. Wolfe," she said as I helped her from her coat, "though the ordeal is cruel." "Sit tight," I said. "We're all enduring something." Arnold Wexler came next, thin and pale, spectacles fogged from the night. He clutched his hat as though it were his last possession, fingers white against the felt. "Goodwin," he whispered. "Must I? This is unnecessary." Mr. Wolfe believes otherwise. He slumped into a chair, wiping his glasses with a handkerchief already damp from his palms. Tommy Keegan slouched in after, cap askew, face defiant. He threw himself into a chair, legs sprawled, and muttered, "You got no right dragging me here." "You'll live," I said. Finally, Inspector Kramer stormed in, hat jammed low, coat damp. He barked, "This is the last time, Wolfe. If you make a circus out of this, I'll haul you in myself." Wolfe opened his eyes fully. "Then I suggest you watch carefully, Inspector. You may learn." The suspects sat in uneasy silence. The lamplight gleamed off brass and leather. I stood by the globe, notebook in hand. Wolfe shifted his bulk forward, hands steepled, voice calm but cutting. "You are all here because Fritz Brenner is dead. My cook, my companion of 2 decades. He was murdered not for money, not for anger, but for deceit. That deceit was written on a list." Vitanza snorted. "A list killed him. Don't insult me." Wolfe's gaze landed on him. "You quarrelled with loan sharks. You argued with Fritz near the alley. Do not presume to instruct me in insult." Vitanza's fists clenched on his knees, but he said nothing. Mrs. Faraday fluttered her jewelled hand. "Surely this performance is unnecessary. Fritz was gentle. Who could harm him?" Wolfe's tone sharpened. Perhaps one who coveted his recipes, who treated him as a supplier rather than a man. "Did you not, madam, solicit his methods as though plucking jewels?" Her cheeks coloured. "He offered freely, out of affection." "Affection," Wolfe said, "does not conceal fraud. You and Mr. Wexler imported delicacies against law. Fritz noticed. That made him inconvenient." Wexler started. "No, he only asked questions. I never—" "You altered your books," Wolfe cut in, "with discrepancies a child could see. Do not insult my arithmetic." Wexler wilted under the weight of Wolfe's eyes. Kramer slammed his fist on the arm of his chair. "Enough! This is innuendo, Wolfe. Produce evidence or I'll clear the room." "You may clear your throat instead," Wolfe said smoothly. "You dismissed the envelope as robbery. Yet what was returned bore my seal upon blank paper. You dismissed the list as ordinary. Yet I have the true list, unaltered, from my kitchen drawer. The one on Fritz was false, carrying an item I never ordered. Grains of paradise." The room shifted. Wexler swallowed hard. Mrs. Faraday's rings clicked. Keegan scowled deeper. "Whoever wrote that list," Wolfe continued, "intended Fritz to inquire. They knew he would not question my hand, only the merchant's. His loyalty killed him. He asked, and in asking, he drew the hand of his murderer." I let silence stretch. Outside, a cab horn bleated, then faded. Keegan spat. "You think I could fake your list? I barely write my name." Wolfe's gaze swept over him. "No, you are a pawn, placed for Kramer's convenience. A slip with your initials was left in the basket. Too crude, too obvious. That was not your work. That was planted." Kramer's face reddened. "You're accusing everyone and clearing no one." "I am weighing," Wolfe corrected. Vitanza shifted in his seat. "So maybe someone forged. Doesn't mean me. I don't scribble recipes. I chop meat." "Yet you wore the grey hat a sweeper saw beside Fritz. You argued, you admit it." "I argued," Vitanza growled, "because he said the list had a name wrong. He thought I'd know who did it. I told him to watch himself, that's all." Mrs. Faraday's breath caught. Wexler tugged at his collar. Wolfe leaned forward, his eyes sharp now, voice resonant. You see? The butcher confirms. Fritz recognized alteration. That was enough to doom him. Which of you then profited by that alteration? Who required the illusion of a list, the camouflage of a forged seal, the planted initials? Which hand is dexterous enough to orchestrate theatre around a man's death? The fire popped, startling Wexler. Mrs. Faraday reached for her sherry, though none had been poured. Keegan muttered curses under his breath. Kramer exploded. This is showmanship. You're baiting them, nothing more. Bait, Wolfe said softly, is the essence. As Fritz was baited with a spice, I bait you with words. The guilty will betray themselves. I glanced at Wolfe, then at the suspects. Their faces were tight, pale, drawn in the lamplight. Every tick of the clock sharpened the air. Wolfe closed his eyes again, immense and implacable, as though certain the trap would spring by gravity alone. And in that silence the conspiracy strained. The office was thick with lamplight and expectation. The suspects sat arrayed in the red leather chairs, each restless in their own way. Vitanza hunched forward, forearms on knees, jaw set hard enough to crack. Wexler dabbed at his brow with a damp handkerchief, his glasses slipping. Tommy Keegan slouched deep, arms crossed, muttering under his breath. Mrs. Faraday sat erect, jewels glittering, her expression frozen somewhere between disdain and unease. Inspector Kramer paced near the globe, cigar stub clenched through unlit, his bulk radiating impatience. Wolfe sat enthroned in his yellow chair, vast and motionless, fingers steepled at his chin. Ladies and gentlemen, Wolfe began, voice even, rich with disdain, you have been patient, or rather, you have been cornered. I shall reward you with disclosure. Kramer barked. Disclosure or another lecture? I've wasted enough man-hours on your theatrics, Wolfe. Sit, Inspector, Wolfe said without raising his voice. You may yet claim credit when I have concluded. Kramer scowled but resumed pacing. Wolfe's eyes opened fully, heavy lids lifting with slow certainty. He reached for the blotter, where 2 papers lay side by side. I had placed them there earlier at his command. The ruined grocery list recovered from Fritz's body, and a sheet torn from a household ledger Fritz had maintained with meticulous care. The list bore the circled item, Grains of Paradise, its strokes loopy and ornate. The ledger bore neat notes of accounts, each written in Fritz's square, economical hand. Observe, Wolfe said. His finger touched the list. This document was presented as mine, or at least as my command. Fritz carried it when he was slain, but it is false. Here, the loops are exaggerated, the strokes curved, flourishes foreign to my style. He shifted his finger to the ledger. Here is Fritz's hand, compact, angular. He crossed items when acquired, he never circled. This list was not his, not mine. It was composed by another. Mrs. Faraday stirred. Surely, Mr. Wolfe, handwriting is hardly proof. Anyone may vary their pen. Indeed, Wolfe said coldly, which is why I obtained exemplars from each of you. Archie. I opened the folder on my knee, handing him slips gathered in recent days, a butcher's bill signed by Vitanza, an order form from Wexler's shop, a delivery receipt scribbled by Keegan, and, most damning, a note penned by Mrs. Faraday to her chauffeur. Wolfe spread them with deliberate care, side by side with the forged list. Examine, he commanded. Vitanza's strokes are blunt, heavy, consonant with his trade. Wexler's hand is tight, nervous, each letter hunched. Keegan, barely literate, scratches rather than writes. But Mrs. Faraday, he tapped the page. Loops extravagant, curves indulgent, descenders curling like ribbon. Compare to the forged list. The match is exact. All eyes swung to her. Her jewels caught the lamplight, but her face drained pale. That proves nothing, she said, though her voice trembled. Perhaps I once wrote such, but not for murder. Madam, Wolfe rumbled, you coveted. You desired my sources, my suppliers of delicacies. You imagined I possessed secret avenues of import, conduits for luxuries denied during ration. You pressed Fritz for them, coaxed with flattery, pressed harder with threat. When he resisted, you devised this charade. She clutched her pearls. No! Wolfe's tone cut sharper. You composed a list that bore my signature of command. You inserted an alien spice, grains of paradise, knowing it would oblige Fritz to inquire. He did. Merchants were puzzled, suspicion stirred. In the alley you confronted him. When he would not yield, you strangled him with cord convenient at hand. Vitanza surged to his feet. So she did it, not me. Sit, Wolfe said, and Vitanza dropped, cowed by the gravity of the voice. Mrs. Faraday's composure cracked. I only wanted to know, she cried, only to know the names he kept from me. He laughed at me, said those lists were Wolfe's alone. He belittled me, treated me like a greedy child. I wanted the list, just the list. Wolfe's eyes burned. You wanted dominion. You wished to flaunt knowledge of rare suppliers, to rule your circle with delicacies none could rival. When Fritz denied you, you killed him. She sobbed once, but Wolfe raised a hand. Spare me performance. Your act extended beyond panic. You staged. You substituted the envelope. You planted initials to mislead. You contrived suspicion to fall upon rough men like Vitanza or the witless Keegan. This was not frenzy. It was theatre, cold and deliberate. Kramer stopped pacing. His jaw worked, but for once he had no bark. Mrs. Faraday's shoulders slumped. I thought no one would know, she whispered. The boy was crude, the butcher desperate, the grocer crooked. Who would look beyond them? Who would think an old woman could— Enough, Wolfe thundered. Do not cheapen your crime with false humility. You wielded arrogance as weapon. You believed yourself above suspicion. That conceit undid you. Silence filled the room, heavy as smoke. Outside, a horn blared faintly, then died into the fog. Kramer moved at last, snapping to his men by the door. Take her. They stepped forward, guiding Mrs. Faraday from her chair. Her jewels clinked faintly as her hands shook. She passed Wolfe without meeting his eyes. Wexler exhaled raggedly. Vitanza muttered a curse. Keegan gaped. Wolfe closed his eyes again, immense and still. When the door shut behind them, the room seemed to exhale. Kramer stood over Wolfe, fists on hips. Damn you, Wolfe. You should have been in homicide. Wolfe opened his eyes a fraction. No, I preserve order here. The law may claim her, but I vindicate Fritz. Kramer grunted, half in respect, half in resentment, then strode out with his men. The office was quiet again, save the tick of the clock. I poured Wolfe a fresh beer and set it before him. He lifted it, drank deep, and set it down with finality. Archie, he said, make record. Fritz Brenner was not slain by chance. He was slain by calculation. His fidelity was used against him. Let it be written that his dignity remains unmarred. I nodded, pencil poised. Outside, the fog pressed heavy, but inside, truth had been laid bare. The widow's loops had betrayed her, and Wolfe, immovable, had preserved his house by exposing the hand that sought to corrupt it. The brownstone exhaled a silence that felt deeper than the fog beyond the windows. The echo of Mrs. Faraday's confession still lingered in the air, though she had been marched away under the firm hands of Kramer's men. The door had closed with a decisive thud, one that seemed to signal more than her departure. It marked an end, of sorts, though not the kind that brought satisfaction. Inspector Kramer remained stubbornly anchored near the globe as though unwilling to grant Wolfe the triumph of watching his back retreat. His hat was in his hand, brim crushed from agitation. His thick jaw shifted as he ground his teeth. Wolfe sat in the yellow chair, eyes heavy-lidded but alert, his massive frame dominating the room without movement. Between them stretched a gulf filled with things neither cared to admit aloud. All right, Kramer growled at last. His voice carried grudging weight. You had it pegged. Damn me if I know how, but you had it. Wolfe inclined his head slightly, as though the admission were no more than a minor courtesy. It was not abstruse, Inspector. The evidence lay in loops and flourishes neglected by your men. Mrs. Faraday's arrogance performed the rest. Kramer's lips tightened. You think we don't check handwriting? We do, but you— he jabbed a thick finger toward Wolfe. You sat here in your blasted chair, letting the world parade in front of you, while my men scoured alleys and cellars. And yet, Wolfe murmured, eyes drifting shut again, it was here the truth settled, not there. Kramer muttered something unrepeatable, then sighed like a man surrendering to an irksome truth. Fine, you've earned your drink, but don't think I'll thank you. Wolfe shifted, reaching for the beer I had already set within his reach. He lifted it with the solemnity of a judge passing sentence, drank deeply, then placed the glass down. I expect nothing so melodramatic, Inspector. Gratitude is not your métier. Go, claim your victory, and let the record reflect that your department prevailed through industry and perseverance. Kramer squinted. You'll never change. No, Wolfe said flatly. The inspector jammed his hat back onto his head. He gave me a look that was half exasperation, half reluctant appreciation. If I had a man like you on my staff, Goodwin, I'd sleep better. You waste yourself polishing his beer glasses. Somebody has to keep him honest, I said. Kramer grunted, turned and left with a slam of the door. The silence folded back over the office like a heavy curtain. I turned toward Wolfe. He hadn't moved, save for lifting another swallow of beer. His bulk seemed anchored in the yellow chair more firmly than ever. That about does it, I said. Case wrapped, papers to be written, reputation salvaged. But that doesn't change one thing. Wolfe's lids flickered open. Which is? That Fritz is gone. The words hung between us. Wolfe didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't betray the faintest trace of feeling. Only the slow narrowing of his eyes suggested the truth beneath the layers. Yes, that is immutable. I rose, restless, pacing the rug with hands in my pockets. He was stubborn, exacting and temperamental, but he was ours. He kept this house in order, in ways even you couldn't have catalogued. Meals arrived like symphonies, not suppers. He guarded your eccentricities like state secrets. He deserved better than to die in a grocer's alley because someone thought he was a key to your larder. Wolfe's gaze remained fixed on some unseen point. He was loyal. He abided by his function with dignity. That's all you'll say? I asked. It suffices, Wolfe replied. It didn't suffice, not for me, but Wolfe was Wolfe, and wringing sentiment from him was as hopeless as draining the East River with a spoon. The days that followed carried the rhythm of transition. The brownstone breathed differently without Fritz's steady steps through the kitchen. The clatter of pans, the firm rapping of his knife, the faint humming that rose when he was pleased, all absent. In their place lingered a hollow quiet that even Fritz would have hated. I was tasked with locating a replacement, an assignment Wolfe accepted with visible distaste. We interviewed candidates, a wiry Frenchman who claimed mastery of sauces but could not prepare eggs to Wolfe's standard, an Austrian widow with a talent for pastries but little else, and finally a stout woman from Queens whose roast chicken coaxed the faintest nod from Wolfe. She was hired, though Wolfe declared at once, she will never equal him. The new cook bustled with energy, rearranging shelves, scrubbing pots until they shone. She tried gallantly to meet Wolfe's instructions, though his brow furrowed at nearly every dish. One evening, I found him alone in the kitchen, inspecting the spice rack. His massive hand brushed against the row Fritz had maintained with soldierly precision. A jar tilted slightly askew caught his eye. He reached, straightened it, then withdrew. You know, I said from the doorway, she'll learn. Not his equal, but no one is. She'll do. She will, Wolfe said, voice low. But the timbre is altered. The kitchen is an orchestra missing its first violin. The music persists, but the resonance is impaired. That was as close to grief as he would voice. That evening, we dined at the table set for 3, as always. The new cook produced a meal that by any outside measure was splendid. Roast duckling with turnips, consommé, and a chocolate soufflé that rose nearly to perfection. Yet each bite seemed burdened with memory. Wolfe ate, but slowly, with long pauses between courses. I tasted, approved, but felt the absence like a cold draught. When the plates were cleared, Wolfe remained seated, hands folded across his expanse. The lamplight gilded the lines of his face, revealing age and weight and something more elusive. Archie, he said at length, arrange for Fritz's ledgers and recipes to be preserved, bound, indexed and stored in the archives. They will not be lost. I nodded. I'll see to it. Silence stretched again. Outside, the city pulsed faintly through the fog. A horn, a shout, a carriage rattling over cobbles. Inside, the brownstone's walls held as steady as they always had. You know, I said, if you had told him once, just once, that you valued him, he might have smiled more. Wolfe's head turned slowly, his eyes steady on mine. He knew. It was the closest thing to tenderness I would ever hear from Nero Wolfe. The evening drew down. I retired to my room, but before I did, I looked once into the office. Wolfe sat immovable in his chair, eyes closed, the faintest crease on his brow. The yellow lamplight washed over him, throwing shadows deep and long across the bookshelves. He looked for a rare instant, like a monument weathered but unbroken. The case was closed. Order of a kind was restored. Yet the house would never sound quite the same without the measured tread of Fritz Brenner in the kitchen, without the scent of his sauces wafting up the stairs, without the gruff dignity of his voice commanding the rhythm of meals. Dinner that night had been complete, yet incomplete. The wine had been poured, the courses served, the silence observed. Wolfe had eaten, I had eaten, and the new cook had done her part. But the ghost of Fritz lingered between us, filling the air more solidly than any aroma of spice or roast. The brownstone endured as it always had, holding its secrets and its silences. Wolfe would retreat to his orchids, I to my desk. Cases would arrive, clients would sit nervously in the red chairs, and Inspector Kramer would storm through the door again. The rhythm of our peculiar household would continue, but nothing would erase the space Fritz had occupied with quiet loyalty and unswerving precision. Wolfe, though he would never admit it, felt it most. I saw it in the way his gaze lingered on the kitchen door, in the faint heaviness of his tread on the stairs, in the long silences that filled his evenings. He would deny grief, call it indulgence, but grief was there, stitched into the silence like thread invisible yet binding. The brownstone's order was restored. Justice had been served, guilt assigned, balance regained, but order is not the same as wholeness, and even Nero Wolfe, for all his girth and genius, could not command the return of what was lost. That truth hung in the lamplight as the city rolled on outside, unheeding, while within, the great detective sat in his chair, and the house settled into a new rhythm, one that bore Fritz's absence as heavily as it bore his memory.